Welcome to video 7 of the genetics video series. Today we're going to be learning about multiple traits. So instead of just looking at one trait like eye color or hair color, we're actually going to see what happens when we try to track multiple traits in the kids. Before we get started for today, there's a whole bunch of stuff that you should have done. If we take a look at the last 3, 17, 18, and 19, you should have already watched the Punnett Square Level 2 video. You should have already read and answered the Punnett Square Level 2 questions. And you should have already taken, hopefully passed, the Punnett Square Level 2 quiz. You can follow along with today on the reading called Tracking Multiple Traits. So if you remember way back from the beginning, here's our molecule of DNA. And remember, it's the individual letter sequence in DNA that controls what proteins are made. This process works by DNA getting transcribed into RNA in the nucleus, the RNA leaving, going out to the ribosomes and getting translated into amino acid sequence, and those amino acids turning into proteins. And those proteins are the things that control all parts of our life, from our eye color to how fast we digest food to how sturdy our bones are. Also remember that in our parents give half of their DNA to half of their sperm and egg and half to the other. And so we get sort of a 50-50 random split of whether or not a parent will donate a certain trait to their kids. We also looked at the idea of phenotypes and genotypes. Remember that phenotypes are the physical looks, whereas genotypes are the two genes that individual has to make that phenotype. All right, so our genotypes are what end up controlling our phenotypes. And then we also use the Punnett Square in order to calculate these probabilities. We walk through our steps to success, and we're able to fill out a significant amount of information. We can actually work backwards or forwards now because we've gone through both Punnett Square videos. So you can start at the kids, figure out the percentages, and work backwards to the parents, or you can start at the parents and figure out the percentage for the kids. Now, up until this point, we've only been looking at one trait at a time. But what we have to remember is that we are not just one trait. We're actually 20,000 different traits all put together. So instead of just looking at eye color, what we're going to do in our last video in this series is look at how do we then calculate more real-world things like what is the probability of having a brown-eyed, black-haired, short child, instead of just looking at one of those traits. In order to do this, we need to expand our knowledge of probabilities a little bit and take a look at what's called the Multiplicative Law of Probabilities. Now, the definition of the law says that the probability of two events, both occurring, is equal to the product, that's multiplication, of their individual probabilities. Now, that sounds a little bit complex, but it's really not that bad. It just means you take both or all three or four individual probabilities, and the probability that all four of them will occur is you just have to multiply the individual probabilities together. For example, let's say that there's a 25% chance that I will find a coin on the ground for today. I'm just completely making up that number. We also know that there's a 50% chance that if I flipped a coin, it would land on heads. So the question then becomes, what is the probability that today I will find a coin on the ground and when I flip it, it will land on heads? So it's not the individual probability in either of them, it's actually combining both together. So it's not just finding a coin, and it's not just a coin landing on heads. It's finding a coin and flipping it when it lands, and it lands on heads. So what we need to see here is that we have two different probabilities to work with. There's the 25% chance that I'll find a coin on the ground today, and there's a 50% chance that if I flip that coin, it would land on heads. According to the multiplicative law of probabilities, all I need to do is find the product of their individual probabilities. All right, our two probabilities were 25% to find the coin and 50% for it to land on heads. So what you need to remember is 25% is actually equal to 0.25 in decimal form. And 50%, if we move our decimal over, is equal to 0.50. Now all you need to do is multiply the individual probabilities together. You take 0.25 and multiply that by 0.50, and what we get, 0.125. Now what percentage does that equal to? Well, remember, all we need to do is move our decimal point 2 points now to the right, because we're turning it back into a percent, and that's equal to 12.5%. Now, we can do this for any sort of genetics problem. All right, we can take a look at one trait, two traits, three traits. We can even take a look at all 20,000 traits if we really wanted to, although that problem would get very complicated. Let's first start off with a simple example. We have a big H, big B, little b mom that mates with a big H, big B, little b dad. What is the probability that they will have a brown-haired, brown-eyed kid? Now, the trick here is that we need to find each individual probability before we find their combined probability. So what we need to look for is what is the probability first that they would have a brown-haired child, and then find the probability they would have a brown-eyed child. Then we need to take both of those probabilities and multiply them by one another. Now, the easiest way that I like to organize this for myself is to break them apart. So we'll take this from mom, this from dad, and this what we're looking for in the kid, and kind of lay it out in a format that looks like this. So we see mom was big H, big B, little b. Dad was big H, big B, little b. And the kid we're looking for has brown hair and brown eyes. Now, the reason I lay it out like this is because you kind of want to think about these going vertically first before you multiply them together. All right, so first let's take a look at the hair color. Now, a lot of these we're going to start to do without doing a Punnett square. If you've done enough Punnett squares, you'll start to recognize the patterns that form. For example, if you have a big H, and a big H, and they mate with each other, you should recognize by now that the Punnett square, 75% of that Punnett square, so 3 out of the 4 squares should be brown hair, and only 1 should be blonde. What that would actually look like, if you still wanted to do the Punnett square out, would look like this. So you get big, 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 little, 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 and then the chunk that we are looking for specifically are these 3 right here, because all 3 of those will give us brown hair. So in this case, brown would actually be 75%, which we'll write as 0.75. Now we could do the same thing with our traits over here, big B, and big B, little b mating to have a brown-eyed child. And again, you could start to recognize on your own without doing the Punnett square, but if you want to do the Punnett square out, it would be the same one as before, big, little, and what you get is big, 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 little, little, little. And then which ones of those have brown eyes? Well, that would be these right here. That's 3 out of 4, which again is 75%. So these are our 2 individual probabilities. There's a 75% chance that the kid will have brown hair and a 75% chance that the kid will have brown eyes. But my original question that I asked was, what is the probability that they'll have a brown-haired and brown-eyed kid together? So if we use our multiplicative law, we just need to multiply the 2 individual probabilities, 0.75 times 0.75, and we get 0.5625. If we move our decimal point 2 spots over, we find that to be 56.25%. So now we know that if these 2 parents mated, there's a 56.25% chance that they would have a kid with both brown hair and brown eyes. All right, let's take a look at another one together. Now, before we do that, what we have to start to see is that only having 2 traits to describe people is not going to be enough here. So what we're going to do is we're going to examine some new traits. All right, we're going to keep our old one in terms of brown hair, big H, is dominant to blonde hair, little h, and brown eyes, big B, are dominant to blue eyes, little b. But we're also going to talk about 3 new traits: earlobes, freckles, and dimples. All right, in this case, the first one, having unattached earlobes, big A, is dominant to having attached earlobes, little a. Having freckles, big F, is dominant to having no freckles, little f. And having dimples, big D, is dominant to having no dimples, little d. So now what we can do is we can actually expand our search out to 5 different traits within a kid in order to figure out its hair color, its eye color, the type of earlobes it has, if it has freckles or not, and if it has dimples. When we talk about attached earlobes, what we're looking at is the shape of the ear. So some people's earlobe on their head, this is the side of their head with their eyes over here and their nose right here. Some people's earlobe attaches straight to the side of their head like that. Whereas some people's earlobe is this is what's known as an attached earlobe. Some people's earlobes, on the other hand, actually move up like that and have this unattached quality to the bottom of their lobe. So you can look at yourself and figure out, are you dominant or are you recessive? All right, so let's take a look at question 1. Now, question 1 on the paper can be translated to look exactly like we see right here, where we have a mom who's big H, big B, little b, mating with a dad who's little h, big B, and we're looking for the probability that their kid will be blonde-haired and brown eyes. Now, we're going to do the same thing as before, where we're going to look at each probability by itself and then multiply them together in order to get the final probability. So first off, we have big H, mating with a little h. What is the probability that that kid would be blonde? Now again, some of you might be able to already do this in your head, but if you can't, you can draw out the individual Punnett Square. Big, little, little. There's big, little, big, little. And what we find is that, how many of them have blonde hair? These two. All right, both of those will have blonde hair, so that would be 50%, which we'll write 0.50. Now, if we take a look back at the other one, we have big B, little b, with big B. Now, if we see this, now what we can know right away is if you ever see a big B, they're never going to have a kid with the recessive phenotype. All right, now you can start to see these patterns on your own, but if you don't, or if you don't trust me, you can do the Punnett Square on its own. And you'd find big B, big B, big B, little b, and big B, little b. And what we would find is what percentage of those kids have brown hair? Well, all 4 of them would have brown hair, which means that's 100%. Now, when we write that out, remember in decimal form, it's 1.00. So all we need to do here in order to figure out this probability is multiply 0.5 times 1.00, and what we get 0.50. Now, what percentage does that turn out to be? That's 50% chance. So there's a 50% chance that a big H, little h mom, and a big H, big B mom, I should say, mates with a little h, big B dad, and has a blonde-haired, brown-eyed kid. Let's take a look at the next one. Now, this next one, what we're looking at is we're actually adding in one of our new traits. In this case, a little h, big B, little D mom mates with a big H, little B, little D dad. And what we're looking for is what is the probability they'll have a brown-haired, brown-eyed child without dimples. So again, we do this in exactly the same way, where we take our traits and we split them up to look at them individually. All right, in this case, little h, and big H, little h, what percentage of those are brown? Hopefully you can start to see the pattern here that both of this should be 50%. All right, you could do the Punnett Square out, and what you would find is 2 of the 4 squares are big H, little h, which means that 50% of them have brown hair. Now, what about eye color? Big B, and little b. What percentage of those kids will have brown eyes? You also should see here that this is going to be 100%, because if you have a big B and a big B, every one of those kids, it doesn't matter what dad is in this case, if mom is big B, all of those kids will have brown eyes. Last but not least, let's take a look at the dimples. We have a big D, and a little d. Now, if we remember back, dimples are dominant to no dimples. All right, so having dimples is the dominant trait in this case. So we're looking for the recessive trait because we're looking for no dimples. All right, so if we did this Punnett Square out, what we'd see is that we'd get a big D, little d, big D, little d, little d. And how many of them would have no dimples? Well, remember, we're looking for the recessive, which are these 2, which would be 50%. All right. Now, do you remember what we should do with all 3 of these numbers? That's right, we need to multiply them together. So 0.5 times 1 times 0.5 gives us 0.25, which is equal to 25%. So what we can now say is that if a little h, big B, big D, little d, mom, mates with a big H, little b, little d, dad, there's a 25% chance that they would have a brown-haired, brown-eyed child without dimples. All right. Now we add in another trait. We add in Freckles to this. Now I want you to try this one on your own. So remember what to do is you need to split up each trait on its own and look at their individual probabilities. After you've gone through that, you should be able to then multiply their individual probabilities to get the final one. All right, so you should pause this video now and on your own, try it. Once you've completed it, unpause the video and we'll go through the answer together. All right, well, hopefully you've been able to get our answer here. So big H, little h, made them together. What is the probability they'll have a child with brown hair? That's 75%. Big B, little b, what's the probability they'll have a kid with blue eyes? That should be 50%. Little d, big D, little d, what is the probability they'll have a kid with dimples? That's 50%. And last but not least with our F's, remember which is dominant, Freckles or no Freckles? All right, well, let's take a look back. Freckles are dominant to no Freckles. So in this case, we're looking for no Freckles. All right, so what you'll notice here is you probably are a little bit maybe confused as to how this one works, but if we look at this cross, big with little, you'll notice that all four of these options should have Freckles and that none of them don't have Freckles, which means that the percentage that this would occur is 0. Now here's the thing, if you ever have one percentage that's ever 0%, that means that they can't have a kid without Freckles, which means you don't even need to finish doing the rest of the calculations because any time that you're going to multiply by 0, the number's always going to be 0. So there is no chance that these two parents would have this kid because there's no chance that these two parents could have a kid that doesn't have Freckles. All right, let's do one more and then you're going to try the rest of these on your own. Now this problem's a little bit trickier because it doesn't give you the direct genotypes of mom and dad. You actually have to work this one out on your own a little bit. All right, so in this case, a man with a dimple and brown eyes. All right, now if he has a dimple and brown eyes, we know that dad has a couple of different options. If he has a dimple, he can either be big D, or big D, little d. And if he has brown eyes, he can either be big B, or big B, little b. Now, how do we choose which one dad is? Well, we have to look at dad's dad. Now, if you take a look, dad's dad has blue eyes and no dimples, which means that in both cases, his dad had to be little, which means the only letter that dad could give was a little b and a little d, which means that this guy can't be either of those two because his dad couldn't have given him a big B and his dad couldn't have given him a big D. So now we know that dad has to be big B, and big D, little d. So if we take a look here, we put these out here like this. Now let's take a look at mom. Mary's a woman. Now we're going to start off right here with a dimple and brown eyes. All right, now mom's in the exact same case. Mom has a dimple, which means mom can either be big D, or big D, little d. And mom has brown eyes, which means she can either be big B, or big B, little b, because both of those will give her brown eyes. But mom's father in this case, all right, mom's father had blue eyes and no dimple again, which means that her dad had to be little b, and little d, which means mom's dad couldn't have given her a big B at all, which means it can't be big B, big B. He also didn't have a big D to give her, which means she can't be big D, big D. So again, now we find that's mom. And we'll lay these out here. Big B, little b, and big D, little d. Now what are we looking for in the kid? We're looking for a blue-eyed child without a dimple. So we're looking for blue eyes and no dimple. All right, now that we have this laid out, it's as easy as going through and doing exactly what we did before. Split them in half. What's the probability that big B, little b will have a blue-eyed kid? Hopefully you're seeing these patterns enough to recognize that's a 25% chance. It's only one of the 4 boxes will be little b, little b. And the same thing over here. There's only one box in this case that will be little d, little d. All right, now we simply take our two individual probabilities, which in this case is 0.25, and multiply it by the other probability, 0.25, and what we get is 0.6. Oh, that's not right. 0.0625. We move our decimal point over 2 spots, and what we get is 6.25%, which means that a man with a dimple and brown eyes whose father had blue eyes and no dimple, and a woman with a dimple and brown eyes whose father had blue eyes and no dimple have a 6.25% chance that they'll have a blue-eyed child without a dimple. Whoa. All right, that is the ultimate version of this kind of question. This is really the pinnacle of what we're looking for with our genetics work. If you can do this, you really have a good, solid understanding of all the genetics material that came before it. If you can't do this, at this point you should be rewinding the video to the point where we're talking about using multiple traits again and trying to find the point where you understand it and starting from there. You want to try this on your own if you feel like you're good to go. In order to do that, you want to read and answer the multi-traits questions, and when you feel like you really have those, take the multi-traits quiz. This is the last quiz that you'll be completing, so good luck.